Math 113, Lesson 7.2, Law of Cosines. So Section 1, we talked about law of sines, and that was used when we're working with triangles and there's not a right angle. Well, sometimes law of sines won't work. We're not given the right information. And so that's when law of cosines comes into play. So we would use law of cosines only when there's not a right angle in our triangle and the law of sines won't work, because law of sines, quite frankly, is a little easier to work with. So if we can use sines, we want to. Otherwise, we will try our law of cosines. So here are the formulas for law of cosines. And we have 3 different formulas just based off whatever information we may be given or asked to find. And again, the capital letters A, B, and C represent the angles, and the lowercase a, b, and c represent the sides. So notice in our formulas, let me choose another color here. Notice in our formulas, if I am using cosine of angle A, then the side opposite it is the one that is out front of this equation. And then the other sides B and C are the ones in the middle of the formula. So that works for all of them. If I'm using angle B here, then the side opposite it is out front, and the same thing for C. So these formulas are not really hard to manipulate. Sometimes we make some arithmetic errors, so we want to make sure we follow order of operations when we are using these formulas. All right, so make sure you have those jotted down. We're going to need those in our problem that we're about to work. Okay, so for example number 1, our directions are going to be solve triangle ABC, just like we were doing in section 7.1. Okay, so at first glance, this looks a lot like a problem that we did in section 1. We're given an angle and 2 sides, but pay attention to the angle and sides that we're given. We are given angle A, but we don't know side A, which is opposite it. So we're not going to be able to use law of sines here. It's not going to work. So this is where cosines is going to come into play for us. All right, so since angle A is the one that we have, I'm going to go up here and use this first formula that I wrote down. Okay, we don't know little a, okay, side A, but we do know angle A, side B, and side C. And so those are all the things that we plug into this first formula up here. All right, so I've got everything plugged in where it belongs. Now I'm going to just walk through the algebra with you because here's where the arithmetic, because here's where some people make some little tiny errors. I'm going to make sure we get it taken care of. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is add my 49 and 64. Now, the next step is where people tend to make a mistake. You cannot say 113 minus 112, okay? That's not what's happening here, because this 112 is being multiplied by the cosine of 120. So, order of operations, multiply comes before this little subtract symbol, so you cannot say 113 minus 112 right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to do the cosine of 120. And the cosine of 120, I'm going to think back to its reference angle is the cosine of 60, would be its reference angle. Okay, and the cosine is 1/2. Now that's in quadrant 1. In quadrant 2, 120 would be in quadrant 2, and the x values are negative, so this would be negative 1/2. All right, So now I'm going to multiply that 112 times -1/2, and I end up with positive 56. And then I take the square root of both sides. Originally, normally I would say plus or minus 13, but this is the length of a side, so definitely positive 13. So A is positive 13. We found one answer. Now we need to know, we were given angle A, we were given little b, and we were given little c. So the things that we need to find are little a, big B, and big C. Right? So we have found this one. Right? So now we need to find our other two angles, B and C. And I can use law of sines from here. I don't have to continue with cosines. Because now that I have the angle that is opposite, the side that is opposite angle A, I can use that. So 13 over the sine of 120. And let's say I work with finding angle B next. Well, 7 is side B. All right, so now I use my law of sines. Again, I'm not going to type anything in my calculator till I've done all of the algebra. Divide by 13. That decimal, I'm going to carry it out several places, because to find B, I will do the inverse sign of that decimal. Make sure your calculator is in degrees. And I end up with about 28 degrees. So now I have found angle B. Well, now that I know angle B, all that's left is to find angle C. And I can find that by subtracting the two that I do know, the sum of them, from 180. And I get 32 degrees. All right, so that would be our first example here. We did use law of cosines, but we didn't have to use it to find all the parts of our problem. Okay, let's try another. Okay, this time we are not given any angles, and so we definitely are not going to be able to use law of sines. Okay, we have to be at least have one angle for law of sines, and then we have to know a side opposite that angle. So we don't know either of those. So we're definitely going to use our law of cosines. Now, in a case like this, when you've got all three sides, what we're going to do, we're going to start by finding, and every time this is what we need to do, we are going to start by finding the angle that is opposite the longest side. Now you may not think that it's going to matter, but it does. And I could go through a big explanation of why it matters, but this is one of those cases where you want to take my word for this one. All right, so we're going to start by finding the angle opposite the longest side. So obviously our longest side is B, so we're going to start by finding angle B. All right. Well, if I want to find angle B, then I'm going to use this cosine formula. So I'll write it down, because that's the one that has cosine B in the formula, angle B. All right, so I know my three sides. Go ahead and plug them in where they belong. All right, and now we need to just do our algebra. Okay, again, make sure that you do not try to subtract that 80. Right, that 80 is attached to that cosine of b. I can add 64 and 25. And now I need to move the 89 by subtracting it from both sides. Okay, you cannot say 89 minus 80. That is algebraically incorrect. So I move 89 to the other side, and now this is what I have. So I'm going to divide both sides by this negative 80, and I'll get my cosine of b. All right, so b is going to be the inverse cosine of negative 11 over 80. And you can actually type that in your calculator just like that. And we get that b is 98 degrees. All right. Once I know angle B, that's enough for me to be able to use law of sines now. So I can say 10 over the sine of that angle I just found, 98, is equal to, and let's say I go to, I want to find angle A. So I'll use 8 over the sine of A. Do all of my algebra before I type anything into my calculator. Okay, and that decimal, carry it out a few places. And now to find A, I do the inverse sine of that decimal, and it will give me my angle. So A is about 52 degrees. And so the only thing missing is C, angle C. So if I take the two I just found, add them together, and then subtract from 180, I will know angle C is 30 degrees. All right. So there we go. So the biggest thing to remember here is when you're given the three sides, make sure you start with the angle that is opposite the longest side. That's really the only tricky thing about law of cosines. And so that's it for lesson 2. Our next lesson will be on polar coordinates. So I look forward to doing polar coordinates next.